So think about these things. I have a hard time figuring out how vampires and werewolves fit into this passage. Okay, we're going to get right into it now. The question is, are vampires fantasy or are they real? Unfortunately, the answer to that is kind of equivocal. It's yes and no. And let me explain that by going the negative first. I would say, in my experience, there's no evidence for these ancient, immortal, vampires that are 500,000 years old, whatever the case might be. I met men that claimed to be that. They could not prove it. And I had no reason to believe that. Now, from a Christian perspective, I doubt if that is the case. Now, the other thing is, you see over the years, and you got to realize the whole vampire thing has evolved over literally millennia. We're going to talk a little about the history of it. But since, especially the Dracula novel came out, there's been certain conventions in vampire fiction that vampires can do certain things. They can change into a bat. They can turn into mist. They can, control your mind, do all this kind of stuff. And frankly, a lot of that I don't have any reason to believe is true. Like a lot of stuff that's in Hollywood, it's just poppycock. But let's look at the affirmative side of the question. First of all, history. You will find, if you go back into history, that literally for as long as we've had human beings, in just about any culture imaginable, there have been the idea of a vampire, of some sort of animated corpse that sucks the blood of the living. This is what Carl Jung would call a universal archetype. And we see one of the earliest manifestations of this is a Sumerian goddess named Lilitu. And Lilitu was, you see there, that's one of many sculptures of her in the graphic, was a being who would prey upon children. She would come into the beds of children and infants at night and suck their blood. And, this was something that was very much feared. And when it came centuries later, the cross-pollination that occurred, because many of you may know that when the Israelites were taken into captivity in Babylon, there was a lot of intermingling of true biblical stuff with things of the Babylonian culture. And so by the time of the intertestamental period, there was this belief among certain sects of Judaism, and even up to this very day, in a Hebraic version of this goddess whose name is Lilith. Now, Lilith, you may have heard that name. She today is kind of like an icon among feminists, especially feminist Jews, because there's this long-standing legend about her, again, that she does prey on children. But supposedly, according to the rabbis, I'm not saying this is true, because I don't really believe that it to be true, but they claim that Adam had a wife before Eve, and that this wife was called Lilith, and she was made out of the earth, just like Adam was. So they were equals. And this isn't in the Bible. And the story is that Lilith got mad at Adam because he wanted to have dominion over her. And she says, well, why should you have dominion over me? We're equal. We both were made out of the earth. I'm just as equal as you are. And so Adam got upset and asked God for a divorce. And so they kicked Lilith out of the Garden of Eden, but not before she became pregnant by Adam. And so she's out there in the lone and dreary world, out of paradise, and is very angry at the Almighty, is angry at, you know how divorces are, I mean, they're never pleasant. She's very angry at her ex-husband, and so when she gives birth, she takes the baby and smashes his brains out on the rocks of the Euphrates River. And out of his brains come all the demons in the universe. And so she is known as the mother of demons and kind of the mother of all vampires. And she's sort of the patron saint, if you will, of crib death. Today we call that SIDS, sudden infant death syndrome, when a baby mysteriously dies and there's no evident cause. Well, some Orthodox Jews would blame that on Lilith to this very day. In fact, they actually have a talisman. When a baby is born, there's all sorts of strange superstitions in Orthodox Judaism about this. That's why they won't name a baby until after he's circumcised. because if they name him before he's circumcised, then Lilith might get him. The other thing they do is they put this amulet over the crib from the moment the baby's, home from the hospital, and it has 3 names on it. Sanvi, Sansanvi, and Samengalef. Those are the names of 3 angels that supposedly the Almighty created to keep Lilith away from babies. And so they pray and ask Sanvi, Sansanvi, and Samengalef to keep Lilith away from the baby. Now, I had to explain all of that just to explain that Lilith is the, if you will, the Hebrew version of the vampire legend. And again, this isn't in the Bible, although there are some interesting elements where Lilith appears to show up in the Bible. For example, a lot of Bible scholars will tell you that the screech owl in Isaiah 34:14 is a reference to Lilith. Also, the terror that is by night, that's mentioned in the 91st Psalm, verse 5, is considered by some to be a reference to Lilith. And we've got to understand something. These pagan deities that surrounded Israel, because remember, Paul tells us that the gods of the heathen are demons. So whether that god is Allah, or whether that god is Lilith, or whether it's Molech, or whatever, these are demonic powers. These are demonic strongholds. And there's this concept in the occult that's called an egregore. And an egregore is where a thought, the little word literally means thought form. And when the thought form has energy pumped into it by people worshiping it. So let's say, for example, I set up the god Bill. And there's this Bill up here, and he's like, we have this little statue, and we all worship Bill. Okay? After a while, this thought form, Bill, starts acquiring energy of its own. And ultimately, it gets enough energy that demons come and live in it. Or a strong man will come and live in it. And then it acquires a life of its own. And the more people down through the millennia that pay attention to this thing, that worship it, or even that fear it, the more energy this thing acquires. That's why, for example, when you have this deity, Allah, which is worshipped by 1 billion Muslims, that has a huge amount of power because it's been coming down for 1,400 years. That's when Islam was formed, about 1,400 years ago. So this is an enormous egregore. Now, the same thing is true to a lesser degree with something like Lilith, because Orthodox Jews, rabbinical Jews for 2,000 years or more have been fearful of this being, that she's going to come and steal their baby, kill their baby. And again, this gives the thing a life of its own. And that's why today, like there's actually a feminist magazine, it's called Lilith.
Our brothers and sisters,